Hello, everyone. I'm Bradley Barth, your webcast moderator and senior reporter at SC Media. Welcome to today's session, Beyond Signatures and Anomalies, Attacker-Centric Web Security, sponsored by ThreadX. In today's modern age of cybersecurity, web applications will face a myriad of cyber threats, from botnets to targeted attacks. All too often, security teams must spend the majority of their time and energy tuning their web application firewall rules to keep up with changing threats and application environments. But an alternative and perhaps more efficient solution is to shift the focus away from the ever-changing list of individual attacks and instead hone in on fundamental attacker behaviors. This session will show how, by monitoring attacker behavior and building attacker profiles, organizations can prioritize the high-risk, high-impact threats, proactively block malicious attackers before they cause damage, and stop chasing down countless application anomalies while focusing on the most malicious behaviors. Our speaker today is Kelly Brazil, Vice President of Sales Engineering at ThreadX. In his role, Kelly is dedicated to helping global customers enhance their web application protection strategies and reduce risk. Kelly has dedicated his career to understanding and enhancing enterprise security and has spent the last 20 years introducing emerging security technologies to customers worldwide and aiding in their implementation. He has broad industry experience and has held positions at top-tier networking vendors and service providers, including UUNet, Juniper Networks, and Palo Alto Networks. After the official formal presentation, we'll conduct a Q&A session. And for those who are interested in slides from this presentation, they will be made available upon request. And so with that, now I would like to welcome in our speaker, Kelly. Kelly, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Bradley. Really appreciate that. You know, here at ThreadX, we've seen, over the past decade or so that WAF technology has been introduced to the market, that there really hasn't been a lot of innovation. Though the threat landscape has changed quite a bit. Applications have changed their deployment models, and also the threats have changed. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in this presentation and see how we can improve on the status quo. And also, we'll do a little demo here to kind of show you what we're talking about in practice. So the challenges of modern application security. So we'll kind of focus on the application side. Obviously, that's had a lot of change. There are web applications out there. There's forms, so that's kind of a known entity. But these are being deployed not only in data centers, but in cloud environments and even in hybrid environments to allow for scaling and bursting and things like that. Legacy apps are, of course, things that traditional WAFs have been known to secure, but even things like web consoles and IoT are things that are important these days because these types of devices can come with vulnerabilities. And also, we're finding that APIs, whether they're public or private, are becoming a large factor. So being able to protect those APIs is becoming more and more important, whether they're RESTful JSON or XML or GraphQL or whatever they are. And then the new trend into microservices and containerization. So being able to find ways to effectively insert security into those types of environments very elegantly and simply without having to, kind of re-architect. So these are the challenges that we're seeing on the way that applications are deployed. But not only that, we're just seeing a lot more applications these days. So, basically, security departments are being tasked with securing more and more applications, so the attack surface gets larger. And we find that, with the traditional approach, with traditional WAF, which are very reliant on static signatures, there's a lot of manual tuning, oversight, and investigation that needs to be done there. So the deck is really stacked against security teams. And so what we find is that instead of being able to cover all apps out there, secure all the apps that are in the organization, really 90% of the effort is focused on the top 10% of apps, and so that leaves quite a large surface area for attack. So there's definitely an issue on the application security side that needs to be addressed. But then we also see that threats have changed, right? So now we don't see so much of a perimeter that we used to. So there's things like zero trust type of architectures. We're starting to see a lot of these applications published straight onto the web. And so that really kind of exposes you to all types of threats that we might not have seen within the confines of a perimeter. And this includes things like bots and continuous scanning. Everyone knows as soon as you put an app up in AWS or Azure or whatever, you're going to start getting scanned on that IP address right away. So it's almost like you're getting a never-ending pen test when you introduce these apps. So there's a lot of fruit that needs to be addressed there. But also the attackers can be anonymous these days. Not only can they come in from Tor exit nodes or other anonymizing proxies, but they can actually shift their IPs around and move around. So for a traditional WAF, it really can't take into consideration that this particular IP address that's moving around is a single entity. And the attack types are very diverse, right? So we're all aware of SQL injection and cross-site scripting and CSRF or XSRF. But then there's also layer 7 DOS and volumetric DDoS attacks. So those are all, pretty standard. And then you also have the slow and patient attacks that kind of stay under the radar. And so we find that, there's certain types of attacks in this list that aren't really the sweet spot for the traditional WAF market today. So really, as we can see, the deck is kind of stacked against the modern, the current IT departments, right, or the security departments. There's more apps, there's more threats, and that means more investigations. So basically, by adding the security layer, it means a lot more work to the staff. So that not only do they have to look at false positives when they come up, but they really have to tune the signatures to tamp those down. So what that requires is someone with a lot of layer 7 expertise, which can be lacking in a lot of organizations. It's very hard to find. And then once you get that information, you have to kind of sift through a pile of alerts to see, if any of these are real and prioritize those. So what ends up happening in the real world is that a lot of these web application firewalls end up being put into non-blocking mode, or when they're tuned, they're biased towards false negatives. Right, so they're basically allowing things to go through. And a lot of times this is because not only is it difficult for the teams to keep up with false positives, but that traffic is very important, whether it's an e-commerce site or something like that that's generating revenue. You don't want to block legitimate traffic. So it's really kind of common to see web application firewalls kind of tuned to allow false negatives. And so it's really impossible to hire enough staff to keep up with all of these apps. And then once the apps change, we know that apps aren't static anymore, they're dynamic. We have agile cycles. That just means that you have to keep tuning the signatures on the WAF. And so that's just more and more work it's hard to keep up with. So there's a lot of operational burden with the way things are done today. And so that kind of leads to the situation that we're in here, where there's a high adoption of WAF. 73% of organizations say they have a WAF, but then when you kind of dig in deeper, you find that only 10 to 15% of the applications are protected within the organization. So the WAF is deployed, but not widely and deeply deployed within the organization, and sometimes it's not even really in blocking mode. So the other thing that we saw within these organizations is that 80% were compromised. So again, the WAF is not really doing its job. Maybe it's just kind of a compliance checkbox. So are we really getting value out of the WAF today? I think it was the Verizon report that just came out. I read it said that the top attack vector that they saw was actually through web applications. So it's very relevant today to be able to protect these web applications. So what are the requirements for a next generation WAF? Well, the nice thing would be to be able to protect without tuning the signatures. So what that requires is automated learning of the application. right? So is this a WordPress application? Is this a custom .NET or Java application? There are different rules or different tunings of rules that would take place depending on what the back-end application is. And ideally, you shouldn't have to do any manual signatures. You shouldn't have to do regular expressions. You shouldn't have to have that deep layer 7 understanding of the application to be able to have a sane rule set that is able to block modern attacks. You should be able to block threats with confidence. So there should not be false positives and false negatives, right? We need to really raise the bar from the status quo where we just expect, a certain number of false positives and false negatives. We need to get to the point where those are no longer the norm. And then not only allow or block, but be able to actively engage to confirm threats. So one of the things that's difficult to discern these days is whether entities that are using the website, are they legitimate users or are they bots? Are they scripted? So being able to understand by actively engaging the threat actors to see whether they're legitimate or not is also important. And then tracking threats over time. So, traditional WAF, one of the issues is that they're just kind of point in time. They're looking to see if a signature fires or not. They're not really keeping state over a long period of time. And that's really where the slow and low attacks happen. So if you're able to keep state over the attackers, then that really aids in understanding which threats are legitimate and which ones aren't really important and don't need to be followed up on. And then, of course, you want to be able to support modern architectures. So this kind of goes without saying, right? Basically, you need an all-of-the-above type of approach, whether it's securing in standard legacy data centers or in the cloud, microservices and containers. You should be able to do that, without any special re-architecture, and even securing APIs and Internet of Things devices out there. So the new approach should be flexible enough to handle all of these scenarios. Now, what we're going to kind of focus in on today is this attacker-centric technology that takes into account the first two sections, where you shouldn't have to do a lot of tuning and you should have a lot of confidence in the outcome of the WAF. So some of the principles of the attacker-centric approach. So we talked about signatures, but there's also some new technologies that have come out lately which are looking for anomalies. And we think that's a good start, but we don't think that looking at anomalies in the application is enough. We think you have to go further than that, because anomalies really look for deviations from the norm, and they don't necessarily show you what is a threat or not. So their results are often inconclusive, and then they require further investigation. And so the whole point of what we're trying to do with innovating on the WAF is to reduce the burden. And instead of doing that by strictly using an anomaly approach, you can actually raise the burden on the security team, because now they have to investigate these things that may or may not be attacks. And then it forces the staff to only block the most severe deviations and miss more of the subtle attacks. So that's kind of one of the things that with anomalies, you want to have a high confidence that something is bad. And by doing that, you're basically kind of weeding out some of the low and slow type of attacks. So the things that we need to identify attackers are to identify the attacker traits and behavior. So we would kind of call this in the security business the TTPs, right? So what are the different tactics and procedures that they're using, and automatically detect their behavior against a kill chain. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit here, but being able to see escalation up a kill chain over time helps you to understand whether an attack is legitimate or not. And by doing that, we can actually automate the process so that the security team doesn't really even have to get involved in the blocking action. And so we can do this using known TTPs, but also machine learning models can help with that as well. We want to actively engage the attackers. So we can do this with interactive deception and also injection techniques to basically manipulate some of the information that's going back to the attacker to see whether they will bite on the honeypot fields, and also to interrogate them to gather more information. So it kind of goes into number 3, enumerate and track the attackers, fingerprint the attackers and track them. So we know that attackers aren't static; they don't just stay on the same IP address. So be able to kind of find these guys as they move around, and share that intelligence across all sites that the customer has and all customers. So one of the things that's pretty well known about traditional WAF is that it's a very siloed type of approach where one WAF might have some information about the attackers that are hitting that particular device, but the other WAF devices in the customer's environment don't have any idea about this information or not sharing that information across. So having shared intelligence across sites is great, but also across customers. And so that really enables us to kind of deep dive and see, is there a deeper or a larger campaign happening here with a botnet or something like that. So I mentioned a kill chain. So most of us are probably familiar with the Lockheed Martin kill chain. So what we're talking about here is not exactly the Lockheed Martin kill chain, but it's basically an escalation of attack states that are applicable to web applications. So what we're talking about is in the earlier stages of an attack, which could be in the reconnaissance and web application mapping. Those aren't the things that the security team really wants to spend a lot of time on because there could be thousands of those happening in a day, right? So those are things that you want to automate the tracking of and to see if they start to escalate a little bit higher into the brute force, DDoS exploitation, malware communication areas where you might want to actually do some active blocking. So in any one of these areas, you may want to do some other type of non-blocking action. So it could be something like tar pitting a host if their queries are taking too long and they're actively trying to take down the backend SQL database. That might be something where you use tar pitting instead of blocking. Or you might do something where you start sending deceptive fields down to the attacker to see if they bot in those, so we can get a better idea whether this is a bot or a real person. And so there's a lot of different things that we can do beyond just a block or allow. So what I'll talk about is, with ThreadX, we'll talk about how we deploy here. The idea is that you want to be able to deploy in any type of environment, whether it's traditional data center, whether it's infrastructure as a service, or whether it's even a Kubernetes microservices architecture. That's all the type of things that we support. And the way that's enabled is by deploying our WAF sensors as a container. And so what that means is that our sensors can run on bare metal, on virtual machines, or even as microservices in Kubernetes. It's all fine. And it doesn't matter where these containers live, since the containers themselves technically are working as a reverse proxy. They're technology agnostic. They can be deployed on the customer premises where the applications live, or maybe the applications live in the infrastructure as a service cloud. We can deploy the containers there very easily. But also interestingly, we can also deploy the containers in the ThreadX cloud, which we have POPs all around the world. And that enables us to kind of act not only as a protective layer, but also as a CDN. So we can do caching and things like that to speed up the applications as well. So the idea here is that we change the DNS to swap the traffic over to the containers. Maybe there's some load balancer configuration that's done to do that. And so there's a couple different areas where we're looking at the traffic. One is, of course, at the sensor layer. So this is where kind of the meat and potatoes stuff is happening. We're doing the application behavior profiling. Again, we're understanding, is this an API? Is this a web app? Is this .NET or Java or whatever it is? And it helps us to understand which types of rules are applicable. The entity behavior profiling. So this is where we're really different, is that we're not just profiling the application, but we're also profiling the attackers and tracking them as they escalate up that kill chain and understanding them. But we're also fingerprinting the attackers to see, is it a single IP, or is this attacker hopping from IP address to IP address, or is this a botnet that we're tracking? So there's a lot of value to that as well. Active response means not just blocking, but some of the other things we talked about. So being able to do the tar pitting and the active deception and interrogation and things like that. And then looking at things like DOS protection. So one of the nice things that we can do since we're profiling the application is we can see, how long is an average request when the user hits a form, how long does it take for that request to come back on average? If we start to see an entity that's really exercising a web application and those requests are taking longer than normal, significantly not longer than normal, then we can slow that attacker down so it doesn't start to bog down the backend database. In addition to the security services, the container does advanced caching. So if the container lives in our cloud, then we can kind of act like a CDN there and take the burden off of your backend. But if you're deploying the containers really close to your application on-prem or in your infrastructure as a service, that also can reduce a lot of the load on the backend servers. And of course, blacklisting, whitelisting, and custom business logic rules, these are all handled on the sensor itself. But in addition to that, we have a cloud component. And so one of the things that the sensors do, and by the way, the sensors are ephemeral. There's no configuration you do directly on the sensors. So they boot up, they have an API key, they log into the cloud, they pull down their configuration, and then they continue to pull down updates and other rules that we push down to them. So they can go up and down in, say, a Kubernetes environment. There's no kind of special, pet configuration that you have to have on each one of these sensors. But in the cloud, what we're doing is we're taking that metadata that these sensors are sending up to us, and we're analyzing that, and we're doing cross-site and cross-customer correlation. And so this is where our SOC, we have a 24/7 SOC that's analyzing this information. They can take a look and see, is there some type of a campaign that's maybe affecting certain verticals, say finance or something like that, and they'll proactively contact our customers to let them know. But we also have an automated system that will push out dynamic rules based on these types of this metadata that we're seeing and the cross-customer correlation. But we're also pulling in intel, whether it's paid intel or open source intel. One of the things our SOC is doing is curating that and adding that to all of the other information that we're pulling from the metadata. So there's a lot of nice work going on behind the scenes here to make the WAF very effective. And so the dynamic rules are pushed down. And of course, if we have the sensors in our cloud, then we can also take on the volumetric DDoS protection as well. The nice thing about this is that it's a very modern architecture. Everything's built on top of a RESTful JSON API. And then on top of that are the CLI and the dashboard UI, which we'll take a look at here in just a little bit. So it makes it really nice and easy to be able to integrate into your existing incident response workflows and also just gather that data programmatically. So again, just a modern architecture. So kind of to bring it all together here, we'll take a look at the evolution of the WAF. So like we mentioned, there hasn't been a whole lot of innovation over the past 10, 15 years. Basically, we've kind of been in that manual attack-centric mode where you're looking at, manual rules and signatures, and there's a high number of false positives using this approach. And, we've seen it takes 2 weeks or longer just to get an application in service because of the signature tuning. And then after that, of course, you'll have to modify the signatures whenever there's updates to the application. And then we've seen kind of the quote-unquote next generation WAF where there's on the application side, the application behavior has been profiled. So they're looking for deviations on the app side. So this provides a little bit of ease on the tuning side for the signatures, but it's not really tracking the attackers to see exactly who they are and map them to the kill chain. So that gets us to ThreadX here. So we consider ourselves a next generation WAF that truly does both the application facing, but also the attacker-centric threat facing automation. So we're basically taking all of that work that the threat team has to do manually today, and we're automating that and making decisions in real time. and also interrogating the hosts in real time to see who they are. And so what that means is that when we block an attacker, there's a very high confidence that that attack was justified. We have all the breadcrumbs there to show that. So in conclusion here for the presentation, and we'll get into a demo, the benefits of the attacker-centric approach, we get very low false positives and false negatives, right? So we're looking at fundamental attacker behaviors instead of looking at just anomalies or regular expression type of signatures. We can use active deception and engagement to drive conclusive detections. So obviously you don't want to block legitimate users. And so if there's a suspicious user or entity, we're going to continue to track it, but not necessarily block it, or maybe we'll even slow that user down. But again, don't want to affect the back-end application, access to that back-end application by legitimate users. And persistent tracking allows us to recognize attackers immediately and see that within the context of the kill chain. So is this an attacker over the last 90 days that has been mapping the application, and now they're actually advancing up to DDoS or exploitation? So that's what the attacker-centric approach gives you. And by doing that, you get reliable automated protection, so you can block with confidence. So you know, very high percentage of ThreadX customers, over 95%, are in blocking mode. So that's pretty much unheard of in the WAF industry, and we give customers that confidence. And this is prevention based on risk and impact to the application. So we're understanding the application, so we're not going to necessarily immediately block, you know, a WordPress attack against the .NET application, right? So understanding the application really helps tune out some of these false positives. And then greatly reduce the amount of event and incident investigation. And at the end of the day, this is what we really want to do, is reduce the burden that the traditional WAF has put on the modern security team, where they have to do a lot of manual investigation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into a demo. So give me just a second here to set this up and log in. Go ahead and start sharing my screen here. All right, I think that's sharing my screen now. And then I'll do my two-factor authentication here. Okay, great. So what I'm showing you now is, I'll go into full screen mode here, is the ThreadX dashboard. And so what we're seeing here is the live mode and a live view, and we can go back 90 days to see all the activity tracking. And of course, you can export this data to your own SIM if you want to keep it longer than that. Everything's in nice JSON format. But I can see the threat level of the sites or site ebbing and flowing here. And this basically correlates to when we see entities that are getting closer to the blocking mode here. And we can see there's a couple entities that are in blocking mode there. And so obviously we can see the attacks geographically, and you can do geographic rules as well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on these three tabs here: the threat entities, the top targets, and the attack states, to kind of show how this next generation WAF is different than a traditional legacy WAF. So when I look at the threat entities, you can see here that we're tracking risk level for each of these entities and intensity. So this is how hard are they, aggressively are they attacking the site. Each entity has a name, and the name is consistent across our customers. So that allows our SOC to track entities. And a nice side effect of that is that if we start to see an entity that is increasing in risk at one customer, that entity will also automatically increase its risk score at your site as well, even if they haven't done anything suspicious. So that cross-customer correlation, even cross-site correlation, is very valuable. An entity can be one or more IP addresses, again, if they're hopping around or if it's a botnet. And then we show the location or locations of the entities. And you can see here we have a bunch of entities in the red zone, so there's been some type of active blocking there. But if you look down at the bottom, there's a lot of entities down here that we've been tracking, but they've done some suspicious things, or they're coming from a suspicious location, or maybe they come from a Tor exit node. Something like that has made them a little bit suspicious, but not enough to block. And so once they cross into the threshold, then we'll start to do some active measures against them, or even just go into temporary or permanent blocking here. So I'll just pick on one of these guys here, Creepy Janzoon. I can see that, so when I go and drill into this particular entity, I can see its location, its geo-reputation, its intensity. It looks like it's been exercising the site very aggressively, its user agent, and then its IP or IPs. And here, if I wanted to, I could just manually blacklist or block it if I wanted to, and write some notes on why I did that. And by the way, our SOC can also see these in tags and things like that. So it's kind of a feedback loop with them. But then I can go in here and see the activity. So if I can go out and actually see the different requests for the different site, the URI, and the parameters that were sent. And so I can see here that this particular one looks like it's a known WordPress attack. And the description is, it's a brute force, and we can see that happening here with all of the different parameters. It looks like this particular entity has been trying to find a login. So it got into the blocking mode quite quickly there. It looks like we took 2 responsive actions where we temporarily blocked the host, and if that keeps happening, we would do a permanent block on that entity. And of course, if I were to look into some of these other ones, I would see, less and less important things here. But this is kind of the meat and potatoes here of what we're talking about from an attacker-centric view, is that we're really tracking these entities over time, over 90 days, and so we can kind of see whether this is a slow and low attack, or if they're just immediately going into the higher levels of the kill chain. The top target is where our SOC lives, and if you have layer 7 expertise, this is probably where your SOC would probably be looking as well. And this is really valuable whenever there are changes to the application to kind of see what are the differences over time. Where are the attackers focusing their attention now? Was there a web server configuration change, and now the bad guys can see the directory listing or something like that? Or was new code deployed and there's a known vulnerability? This is what our SOC takes a look at, and if we see a large spike, then we will notify our customers and let them know. But the nice thing is that our SOC has that layer 7 expertise as well, so that they'll actually help our customers fix what's going on here. So even though we're virtually patching this type of stuff and the attacks are being blocked, it's still good to have that hygiene on the back end so that the server's configured correctly and the application doesn't have known vulnerabilities. So that's what this view is all about. And then finally, the attack state, so mapping these to our version of the kill chain. So looking at over the last 4 hours here, all the different web application mapping, exploits, and things like that. So I can go in here and basically take a look and see what type of attacks have happened here. And I can see, the signature IDs and the descriptions. So this is a possible comment spam, and we see directory traversal characters in there. I might be able to find something a little bit more interesting to show. Let's say, malware communication maybe. So here, if I go into one of these guys, I can see the description. And this is what I wanted to highlight this because this shows how our behavior rules are different than a traditional WAF signatures, which are more kind of regular expressions. Now, that's not to say we can't do regular expressions. We can actually do very detailed rules via business logic. We can get all the way down to regular expressions and time-based rules and all of that. But at its base, what we try to do is make these kind of atomic, simple rules. So, for example, do I see a right bracket character? Do I see a left bracket character? Do I see different keywords like PHP, CMD, EXE, things like that. So if you were to have these types of rules in a traditional WAF, it would just, it would blow up with too many false positives. But since we're tracking these behaviors to entities, that's how we get very accurate results without the false positives. So that's a very important thing to understand, the way we're different there. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show from the dashboard here. So if you do have any other questions on that, we're happy, obviously, to do a more in-depth demo with you as well. So what I'll do here is I'll go back to the slides. And I think now we have some time for Q&A.
Okay, great. Yes, let's jump to the Q&A. Here's the first question for you, Kelly. Can you give me an example of a threat that an attacker-centric model would block that a signature-based model would not, and vice versa?
So that's a good question. I think the most obvious one that comes to mind would be 0 days. So an example of that just came out recently was that there was a new Apache struts vulnerability that came out a couple of weeks ago. And so because we use a behavior-based approach, ThreadX customers were automatically protected by that because that was suspicious activity, and as it escalated up the kill chain very quickly, it was blocked. But in addition to that, we also took a belt and suspenders approach, and we virtually patched it with just a rule as well. So we'll do both as we deem appropriate, but that's a type of attack. The other thing that's interesting would be understanding the difference between a legitimate user and a bot, right? So being able to do that attacker fingerprinting, the interrogation, and the cross-customer correlation helps us to understand legitimate traffic versus bot traffic. And then I guess your question was vice versa. Actually, I can't think of a type of attack that a traditional WAF would be able to find, that we wouldn't, because we have all the same capabilities and more.
All right, great. Let's move on to the next question, kind of a three-part question here. How fluid is the kill chain? Can I expect attackers to follow each step? And how quickly can someone progress through the kill chain?
All right, so the attack kill chain can be quite fluid. So you might find some attackers that totally skip the scanning phase, or maybe the WAF wasn't put in line in time to see the initial phases. So it'll go immediately to kind of the higher levels. And so if you see that, you definitely want to start blocking right away, because there's no sense in letting legitimate bad traffic going back to your sites. And we've seen attackers escalate up the kill chain, between, it could be seconds, right? Because it could just be a simple type of a scanner that sees something, and then as soon as it sees that, then it'll run the attack against it. Or it could be something that takes weeks. So that's why we track entities for 90 days, so we can see those slow and low attacks.
Okay, great. Next question here. Do you have any suggestions in regards to Internet of Things security?
Yeah, that's obviously something that's becoming more and more relevant. We see a lot of the web consoles used to control these things are put out by vendors, and they're there for convenience. Really, they're not typically secured, and we find more and more that these things can be compromised in many different ways. So it's probably something people don't think about because of how difficult it traditionally is to insert a WAF. But what we're saying is that now with next generation WAF, you can insert a WAF to cover 100% of these web applications, and that includes these consoles to Internet of Things. And so that really locks down that attack surface area, because people are deploying these Internet of Things without even the security department knowing about it. So that's just another kind of process thing. Security is not just technology, it's also a process. So being able to find Internet of Things and then secure them with some type of technology like a next generation WAF.
All right, great. Next question. How would ThreadX integrate with an existing SIEM to provide a single pane view to users?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone wants a single pane, and so one of the nice things about ThreadX is that we're not trying to inundate you with a ton of data. You shouldn't be seeing 10,000 logs, a second from ThreadX, right? We're really trying to reduce that burden and only show things that are important. But to that end, you still want to have that data in your data lake or your SIEM. And so since we're fully API driven, we send out our events via JSON format, so they're very easy to integrate. We have a syslog emitter, and we also have webhook. So if you want to consume things in that way, that's possible.
All right, great. Next question. Do I need to have a personal SOC to use this?
Well, one of the deployment models that we have is fully managed, and that's kind of different, right? So there are cloud-based WAF out there, but you're still kind of managing it yourself. So we cover the whole spectrum of deploying as just a SaaS-based WAF, and you have your own SOC that is managing it, all the way to we have customers that really don't have any layer 7 experience at all on their team, and they are basically augmenting their staff with our SOC. We will fully manage the sensors, whether they're in our cloud or if they're on-prem. The deployment model is totally up to you.
All right, moving on to the next one. What happens if an APT persists longer than 90 days? Will ThreadX still detect it?
So we're going to continue to track it. So even if it goes longer than 90 days, we might, some of the initial scanning may drop off. But yeah, we will still, any activities that it's doing in that 90-day window will still be there. But that's definitely something that we can look into. If we start to see attacks that are longer than 90 days, we could probably persist certain, known entities longer than that. But so far, what we've seen is 90 days is a good amount of data for that.
All right. Another APT question here. Can ThreadX detect hybrid APT attacks across multiple threat actors working as a distributed group? So
we're going to do our best with that, right? So one of the things that we do is we track entities, and of course entities can be multiple IPs, so that'd be one method of tracking kind of a larger group. But that's actually where our SOC comes into play too, in our data science team. So there's some things that we can do in an automated fashion, and there's other things that our research team and our SOC does in a manual way, right? So some things like that include, tuning of intel, right? There's some automated ways of doing that, and then there's just the day-to-day experience of the SOC, and also by tracking the entities, we've automated the kind of hard part to say, okay, we see these things happening in an escalation of the kill chain, and then that allows our SOC to go back in and say, tease out what are the higher level patterns here. So that's how we would address that type of thing.
Great. Next question. Would ThreadX be able to? Yes. Would ThreadX be able to detect and stop distributed denial of service generated by DNS recursion?
So there's two different types of DDoS that we protect from. One is the layer 7 DDoS, and we kind of talked about that in the presentation a little bit. And that is based on, among other things, there's application-specific DDoS, right? But there's also DDoS based on exercising the backend database. So that would be profiling the app, understanding what the average time of request responses, and if you see a significant deviation, then we'll slow down or maybe even eventually block that entity. The other type of DDoS would be the volumetric. So if we are hosting the sensors in our cloud, then we would take on that responsibility of understanding, the volumetric side of it. We would also be taking on some of the DNS. Typically, we don't take on the DNS-specific DOS attacks, but we host our DNS infrastructure in the facilities and services that are protected from DDoS. So we do have partial coverage there. But then if the sensors are deployed in our cloud, then we also have the volumetric DDoS that we protect from as well.
We're getting some great questions. Here's another one. Can I deploy on-prem without connection outside to your SOC?
So you would lose some benefits by doing that. Technically, it is possible. I think the best case scenario there would be to deploy and have it initially, log in and pull down the config, and then it can be disconnected for some time. But for best results, you want to have a continuous connection. But intermittent connectivity loss is totally fine.
Okay, next up. Do you have a list of SIM products that you can integrate with?
I mean, basically anything that can talk to JSON or syslog format. So it would be all the top players out there. There's really nothing special about doing that. So we can talk to all the major players.
All right, great. Next up. I have been using a signature-based web application firewall my entire career, and I'm hesitant to make the change to a new tool I'll have to learn. Should I be? So, I mean, it sounds like this person has a lot of experience, right, and already has a lot of layer 7 experience. So the idea here is that their knowledge is directly applicable here. It's just going to make their job easier because now we're going to be sifting through and only bubbling up the prioritized events. So I think, obviously I'm biased, but I think that that would be a good investment into just basically learning a new tool. And then just, as you see the market itself kind of evolving, it's always good to kind of, be introduced to kind of new technologies that are out there that, that the business side sees as valuable, right? So obviously for a CISO, limiting the number of, bodies that they have to hire just to support a WAF when they want to onboard, many more applications, that's in our kind of in your self-interest, right? But the idea here is that because, with all that experience on the traditional WAF, this individual's probably only been able to protect, a small number of applications because, it's kind of exponentially grows the amount of effort involved, the more applications are added. So in this way, you'd be able to actually protect more applications with less effort. All right. I think we can do one, maybe two more. Can ThreadX characterize entities by their TTPs, their tactics, techniques, and procedures, and generate behavioral reports by threat actor? Yeah, exactly. So that's what we do. You basically kind of described exactly what we do. So there are machine learning models, but a lot of the behavior rules are TTPs. So just kind of a little trivia, our CTO and one of the major developers of the product is a penetration tester, was in his past life. So the whole idea was to think like a hacker and to use those behaviors and to automate the detection of those. So our rules are very TTP based, along with the machine learning classifiers as well and models. So yeah, that's what we're basically doing. So when we do a block or as we're tracking the entities, you actually see the breadcrumbs of all the TTPs or all the behaviors that they've done over time. And so that's the reason why we give a high confidence whenever we do a block. All right, very good. Well, with that, I think we've just about run out of time. And so with that, today's session has concluded. As a reminder, this webcast will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on the SC Media website under the Events tab. And again, if you're interested, slides will be made available following the presentation upon request. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest, Kelly Brazil, for joining us today. And, of course, thanks to everyone else for tuning in. For SC Media, this has been Bradley Barth. Until next time, have a safe day online.
Thank you.